Hi, everyone. So please take your seats. I hope everyone is well seated. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay. So thank you all so much for being here. It's a pleasure to see a full room at the end of a very busy week. We're very grateful to have some of your time and attention here. We're wanting to do kind of a wrap up of this week and also of bond negotiations that are coming to an end as well here. So we are happy to be sharing a bit of this time with you today. So I'm Leah Reichert. I'm Deputy Director of Energy Transition at CEBRI. The CEBRI is the Brazilian Center for International Relations. We're Brazil's main think tank on international relations, and we have a lot of work on climate and energy transitions, land transition, and obviously this year, as you can imagine, we're very busy with COP. So this event is within a context of a broader series of discussions and reports that we're going to be drafting around COP and to influence negotiations and to influence the action agenda as well. So this is a bit of the context, but I wanted to start by actually thanking very kindly E3G, our co-organizers today, and especially Bruno. Thank you so much for joining this adventure with us. It's been a pleasure to collaborate. And thank you also to our hosts, King's College London, the Policy Institute, especially Sophia and Mari for their help. It's wonderful to be in such a nice and vibrant place in the middle of London. For us, it's been also very charming to be discovering the city again. I also wanted to thank our sponsors. So at CEBRI, we have our COP-related activities are with the support of the Institute for Climate and Sustainability, IX, which is a major actor in the climate scene in Brazil, and also Itaú, and we have the support of APCO. So thank you so much to our also supporters for this event. And thank you to the public for being here once again. So without further ado, we'll start diving deep into this event, in which we'll be discussing how to close concretely the implementation gap. How can we actually bridge the gap between ambition and actual climate action, actual NDC implementation through concrete actions, concrete mechanisms that can be thought of. Maybe some have emerged throughout the last weeks, maybe also some already in practice, and we can see how to scale them. Probably a lot of challenges also related to this. So we'll be looking through the climate finance angle, through the sectoral engagement angle, to actually be able to see what kind of concrete measures and mechanisms can be put forward on the road to COP. The idea here is really to also be able to help and give insights to the COP presidency. So that's my transition. I wanted to thank the Brazilian Embassy for being represented here. We'll have also a bit further down the road, Ambassador Corrêa do Lago, the COP president, joining us. But for now, I wanted to welcome Alexander Brazil, the Deputy Head of Mission for the Brazilian Embassy, to give a few welcome remarks.
Well, the ambassador, first of all, I have to convey my apologies. The ambassador conveys his apologies. He was unable to come here. He asked me to represent him. And I know it feels like you bought tickets to see a star and you got the understudy, but bear with me. I will try to read his speech as keenly as he would do it. It's a pleasure. I do not forget something that I have to say by myself. I would like to thank you, CEBRI, E3G, and the King's College, because they are partners of the embassy in several different opportunities. So it's very nice to be here and to be a part of an initiative conducted by them. Well, first of all, let me say it's important. It's a pleasure to open this discussion at a time when international cooperation and informed dialogue are more essential than ever. As we reflect on the road to Belém and beyond, it is encouraging to see the convergence of actors here today from government, academia, civil society, and the private sector, all engaged in the shared efforts to translate ambition into implementation. A few weeks ago, the South by Southwest London Conference represented an opportunity to reflect on what it means for a country to be recognized as a credible partner in global climate efforts. In today's world, Where trust in international process is increasingly fragile, reputational capital is earned through coherence between that, what is said, and what is done, and through sustained, transparent engagement with a broad range of stakeholders in the international community. Brazil's engagement with the global environment agenda spans more than 3 decades and includes several milestones. The Rio Earth Summit in 1992 resulted in 3 major international conventions, including the UNFCCC, there are lots of Cs, addressing critical environment challenges. Rio Plus 20 in 2012 helped pave the way for the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. Our current preparations to host COP30 in Belém, in the heart of the Amazon, are part of this continuum and offer an opportunity to elevate the voices of vulnerable regions and communities while fostering collective responses grounded in equity and science. Domestically, recent indicators show encouraging progress. Deforestation in the Amazon has declined by 46% over the past 2 years, and national rates have dropped by 32%, alongside a firm commitment to end illegal deforestation by 2030. These efforts are part of broader policies that promote low-carbon agriculture, the sustainable use of biodiversity, and support for forest-based economies. Brazil's energy mix also offers relevant insights. With 93% of our electricity sourced from renewables, the result of decades of investment on hydropower, bioenergy, wind, and solar, Brazil has built a resilient and low-emission energy system. While this achievement brings its own challenges, it illustrates the potential for large, diverse economies to pursue clean energy transitions at scale. Of course, implementation remains the critical test. As Ambassador André Corrêa do Lago rightly pointed out, the legal framework for climate cooperation already is in place. The financial resources also exist. What we need now is the political will to operationalize them through innovation, commitment, and initiatives such as the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, also now a lot of Fs. TFFF is a proposal designed to offer predictable, long-term financing for forest conservation based on integrity and transparency, with a significant share directed to indigenous and local communities. Earlier this week, Minister Marina Silva and Ms. Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, launched the Global Ethical Stocktake. This first dialogue, held at Kew Gardens, brought together not only climate experts such as Kate Hampton and Lloyd Stern, but also artists and representatives of marginalized and vulnerable groups, including the Roma communities of Europe. It is a process that seeks to expand the climate conversation beyond technical and financial frameworks to encompass values, principles, and moral clarity. The Global Ethical Stocktake is the first in a series of 6 dialogues to be held across 6 countries, a timely effort to surface the deeper social and human dimension of climate action. The European debate shared by Mary Robinson highlighted several ethical challenges that must be addressed if we are to move forward credibly. One is the urgent need to combat disinformation, which undermines public understanding and weakens the momentum for change. Another is the responsibility to raise awareness of the cost of inaction, a cost borne disproportionately by the most vulnerable. The discussion also underscored the importance of holding governments and institutions accountable for their voluntarily assumed commitments and of exposing practices that exacerbate the climate crisis through a global network of voices advocating for sustainability and peace. These are not abstracted risks. Inaction has material, measurable consequences. It lost livelihoods, degraded ecosystems, and the erosion of trust in institutions. It's just not a political or technical failure, it's increasingly a moral one. And as we gather today during London Climate Action Week, alongside more than 700 parallel events, we are reminded of how vibrant and engaged the global community has become. It is with gratitude that we recognize the perspectives and proposals from Brazil, how perspectives and proposals from Brazil are received here with interest and respect. And we hope they can contribute meaningfully to advance the spirit of collaboration and shared responsibility. It's relevant to acknowledge the ongoing and fruitful cooperation between Brazil and the United Kingdom in areas such as energy transition, sustainable finance, and climate resilience. These partnerships, grounded in mutual respect and exchange of knowledge are helping to advance concrete solutions and promote a greater balance in international efforts. Indeed, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has commended both Brazil and UK for updating their national determined contributions, NDCs, ahead of schedule under the Paris Agreement. And we have to remember not many countries have done so. A gesture that reinforces the shared commitment to ambition and accountability. As we look ahead to COP30 in Belém, we envision it not merely as a diplomatic summit, but as a global mutirão. And I know how mutirão is hard to speak for some non-Portuguese speakers. But as Ambassador Corrêa has described it, mutirão is a collective mobilization, something that brings together states, multilateral institutions, civil society, youth, business, financing communities from all walks of life. Implementation cannot be a footnote to ambition. It must be our central focus. Thank you very much for your attention and for your ongoing commitment to a climate agenda that's not only effective, but also just, inclusive, and grounded in our common humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandre. So now we're going to be starting our first panel. So I would like to welcome our moderator and host of this panel, Clarissa Lins. Clarissa is member of CEBRI's International Advisory Board and also founding partner of Catavento Consultoria. And already also called the panelists to the table. So please, Ed Weber. Ed Weber is Deputy Director for International Financing and Sector Transitions of the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero of the UK government. And Mark Van Arkelen, former European Union Climate Ambassador. Please come to the floor, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Leia, for the introduction. Thank you, E3G and CEBRI. You forgot to mention that I'm chair of the Energy Transition Program at CEBRI, so it's my another hat. And thank you, King's College, also for hosting us for one of the last event of the week, right? So congratulations, we are all here to listen to the voices that are still vivid at this stage. So it's my pleasure to be here. Francisco Gaetani had to leave beforehand, so that's why I'm supposedly the Brazilian on the stage, but I'm not supposed to talk on behalf of the Brazilian government. So everything that I will say, it's please take it as a personal perception and nothing official. So to start with the conversation, I have a couple of questions with you, UK and EU. I know that you are not in post anymore, but thanks to your great experience, Mark, will benefit all from what you've learned throughout those years, participating into very important negotiation, and Ed as well, as a current, I don't know if I have to introduce you, but as working at the UK government. I will keep it short, correct? So the first question has to do with something that was mentioned by our opening remarks, which has to do with the new NDCs. So countries were supposed to present their new NDCs up to February this year. A couple of them have done so, including UK and Brazil. EU is supposed to deliver its new commitments soon. We still don't know exactly yet. But the main thing is what to expect about of this new set of NDCs. Is it, will they still hold to 1.55 degrees? This is the big question. But I would say that even more important than the ambition might be the implementation. So COP30 is so-called COP, the implementation COP. So what to expect in terms of NDC unfolding? Are the roadmaps being also developed? What are the kind of mechanisms in place? So if you had to give your opinion on the level of readiness of our implementation roadmap, what would you share with us? And I'll start with you, Ed, as UK is at the forefront of this discussion as well, together with us, Brazil. What can you share with us from your experience?
Great, thanks very much, Clarissa. Hi, colleagues. So I'm Ed Webber from the Department of Energy Security Net Zero here in the UK. Thanks to CEBRI, thanks to E3G for hosting us, and congratulations to Antonia and team for surviving through to Friday on what must be one of the best warm-ups for Belém, I imagine, that you're going to have this year. Maybe just to start with what sits behind the process for developing the UK's own NDC, which obviously is now out there for 2035. And I think we found the process of developing this drew on a whole range of different sources and prior pieces of activity that we could then lift and shift. So to begin with, the UK obviously is not starting from a blank piece of paper. We were the first country to put into law a net zero target and our own Climate Change Act, which provides the basis for our 5-yearly carbon budget process, obliges the government to ensure that we have agreed a carbon budget that is in line with that net zero trajectory, and bringing forward the policies and measures that are going to be in place to have confidence that we can meet those arrangements. So under that pre-existing mechanism, we already have a 2035 measure, which is a 77% reduction on 1990 levels. So that was our sort of prior starting point. We then looked very hard at ensuring that, hopefully colleagues can hear me, our own independent climate change committee advice. And this body is really, really powerfully unique. It combines the latest and best in climate science, economics, policy expertise, how the financial system is evolving and so on, the S-curves that are evolving in these clean technologies. And we were discussing before with Mark that the transition is not a linear process, it is a dynamic one that is constantly evolving, and you have to try to ensure that your modeling is up to speed to allow for that. And that Climate Change Committee came forward with advice and a set of proposed targets. The government isn't obliged to take those on board, but is obviously expected to consider them seriously. And indeed, in turn, we decided that would be our basis for setting our 2035 NDC itself. And that ensured that at every stage, this was 1.5 degree aligned, that it sat within the sort of Paris-consistent equity metrics, and that we were able to bring it forward early to try to set the sort of benchmark of what good looks like for other countries. I think the other thing I want to say, and I don't want to preempt your subsequent questions, but in the process of doing this, it isn't simply a case of setting targets. It's really a case of setting targets with a very, very clear understanding of how you're going to instantly move into implementation, and having enough time to think all that through in advance and be able to spot gaps and spot those issues in advance. So, and that is the real beauty of having both a target setting process, an independent advisory body that brings all of the sources of expertise together, and a carbon budget setting mechanism, which in itself requires us to have a full package of pan-economy measures and policies designed and in place, and an awareness where there is further work to do that we have to then update those measures. So it instantly gives us a springboard into implementation off the back of those. And I think it's a really powerful model. It's a model that seems to be working well for us. And I encourage others, and I know many other countries have looked at this model and are trying to emulate it in different ways. I suppose the other thing I would say as a first question, without hogging the microphone too much, is this really is one of those absolutely critical moments for all countries to stand up and reflect on the collective agreements that we have put in place on previous COPs. And that means bringing forward those NDCs early enough so they can be factored into the UN NDC synthesis report, and at a level of ambition that is consistent with the targets we have all set. So while I'm not holding Mark single-handedly to account for this, obviously we encourage the EU to emulate that and to seek to do so by September this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, for kicking this conversation. And I will echo your points around establishing into law, first of all, but then setting a 5-year carbon budget with the sound targets, implementation, and an independent advisory body, which is, I believe, also very helpful into implementation and into, I would say, providing even more trust on what's being proposed as scientifically driven and based. Mark, what to expect from EU? I know that you've had this role for many years. What to expect from your current responsible for the climate action in Europe?
Thank you, Clarissa, and very happy to be with you at the end of the London Climate Week. I mean, on the EU target for 2035, the European Commission will come out with its proposal on the 2nd of July. That will be a proposal, first of all, on 2040, because that is how the European system works. You have a target for 2030, we're now going to have the debate on the target for 2040, and from that we're going to backcast into 2035. The Commission came out with its analysis already 15 months ago. I mean, in February of last year, the Commission came out with its model and evidence-based proposal. Of course, it was a communication. It was not a legal proposal in the proper sense. But then it was said that the EU should go for -90 in 2040. Then it was said that these cuts should be exclusively domestic. The reason being that in the past, through the CDM, the EU has had a sobering lesson. The CDM basically ruined the European trading scheme for quite a while, the emissions trading scheme. And so the idea was, let's do this domestically. I think that as a result of the current discussions in a context which is very different from the one that we were in February of last year, because now the rage is all on competitiveness and security and geopolitics, that in all likelihood, and that's at least my forecast, we're going to have some what are called flexibilities. Flexibilities meaning that a certain percentage of this 90% can be reached through carbon credits bought outside the EU. What that percentage is, still up for grabs. I hear 3%. The other day, a French member of parliament, very close to Monsieur Macron, said perhaps 5%. So that is all in flux. Once we have a 2040 target, then we have to decide on 2035 target. And obviously, one of the questions will be, we are in 2030 at -55. By the way, the European Union is very close to reaching it. The latest forecast that I've seen will be 53%. So the EU has delivered on the 2030 target, one of the few parts of the world having delivered. But then the question is, when you go from -55 to say 90, what does that mean midway? When you do it in linear fashion, you get to something like 72.5. Some say you should be more ambitious than that. There are, of course, others saying, why should we front load, right? The proposal will come out on the 2nd of July, and then it's going to be breakneck speed if we want to still make it for the UNFCCC synthesis report, which the Secretariat, I think, is going to draw up by the end of September, for Belém in November. Knowing a bit the system, and also knowing the fact that in August very little happens in Brussels, it's going to be, in my view, touch and go to have this cut and dry by the end of September. But yesterday night, the European Council met in Brussels, and there was a first, apparently pretty heated discussion on the matter. I think there is an overwhelming majority among the member states to go for -90%. The question is then one of modalities. Now, you don't need unanimity, you need a qualified majority and the consent of the European Parliament. So that's where we are with regard to 2040, 2035. Now, in terms of the EU governance or the governance of EU climate policy, how do we do it? much like the UK, we have put in place in 2021 the EU climate law, which is the anchor of EU climate policy. It obliges to set evidence-based targets, so 2030, 2040. In the climate law, we already said in 2050, the European Union will be net zero. It is held by, as I said, analytical work, a lot of climate modeling, as well as an advisory climate body. But the body is advisory. The advisory body has come out with an opinion. A few days ago, it reiterated that opinion and said it should be at least 90% and everything should be domestic.
Without carbon offsets.
But that is what it is, an advisory opinion. In the end, obviously, in a democracy, politics prevails. What is also very important to bear in mind is that the EU climate law has a course correction mechanism built in. If you stray away from your target, the EU is obliged to take course corrective measures. That is one of the reasons why we're pretty close to 55%, because when it was noticed that a number of member states, for their part, the climate policy is partly the EU, and the EU is responsible for the ETS. The main working horse for the European Union to get to its targets has been carbon pricing. In the electricity or in the power generation sector, in industry, we have made fantastic cuts. Now, the next big task is to get onto the sectors that have not been covered so far with emissions trading. That's transport, heating, and agriculture. Transport and heating will be covered by ETS too. And that should kick in next year, where the distributors of fossil fuel for transport and heating will have to pay upstream for the CO2 embedded in their emissions. So that is where we are. It's a system that works well. The main problem so far has been the member state level, so transport, heating, agriculture, and waste, precisely because of the fact that the emissions from transport are not coming down, and that those of heating, which is 1/3 of emissions, doesn't come down quickly enough either. It has now been decided to cover that as well by another mechanism of emissions trading, which will be separate from the first, and that is ETS 2. So that is where we are. I think we have the EU has a pretty robust governance system, but it's going to be reviewed next year. Let me leave it at that.
But very interesting, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the ETS mechanism, because I understand that it has been crucial as a way to really provide the market signal and the price signal to drive investments, maybe behavior. We were talking a little bit about behavior beforehand, but certainly providing the right tone for the market to invest. I know that UK is also working on such a mechanism, Ed. What would be other ways to accelerate action? Price signal is absolutely crucial, we know that, but what else?
Great, well, I'm delighted to see the progress that's been made on the emissions trading system in the EU. In fact, in a former life, some time ago, I worked on 3 consecutive reforms of the EU ETS when the price was around €3 a tonne, and you look at it today, I'm not sure what it is, but it's certainly a lot more than that. So, and I think it's the insights and learnings that have come from that experience are now kind of globally relevant for others who are designing their own emissions trading systems. So other ways to help support implementation, obviously you mentioned we have our own ambitions for an ETS system as well. I talked a bit about our own carbon budget mechanism, which gives us the foundations for thinking through systematically, sector by sector, 5 years by 5 years, exactly the suite of instruments that hopefully are mutually reinforcing to help us ensure we're on track to our targets. We will be updating our current fourth, fifth, and sixth carbon budget, so implementation plans in the coming months, and to ensure that we're sort of fully in line with our net zero trajectories and our 2035 NDC. There'll be a further carbon budget coming up in June 2026 for carbon budget 7, which will also kind of give us a further 5 years worth of foresight on where we want to go. So that remains the sort of spine of activity. But you're right, there are many, many layers beneath that, and maybe I'll just pick out one which is particularly prominent right now for the UK, which is around the power transformation. So obviously the UK has been working on power transformation for some time. In fact, we were the first G7 country to fully move away from coal power last year, closing off our last coal power plant, which is quite sort of a totemic moment for us if you think about the role that coal has played in the UK's economy since the Industrial Revolution. And we're currently around 40% of renewable penetration as our power mix. But we know we need to go a lot faster. If you look at the basis of a lot of our different plans, electrification of as much as you possibly can is kind of the underpinning. So we are going to be leaning extremely heavily on the grid, and we're looking to decarbonise that grid as fast as possible, which is kind of sits behind the current government's plans for what they're calling mission or Clean Power 2030 mission. And really what that means is we want to be a near fully decarbonised power grid by 2030. There won't be absolutely everything. There will need to be some flexibilities around that, but the ambition there is a absolutely enormous scale of rollout of renewable deployment, and with it a huge amount of upgrades to our grid system. And that is a huge policy, engineering, and fundamentally a coordination challenge across government, across all the different levers of government, from the Crown Estate that own a lot of the land, to the department I sit in, which does a lot of the energy planning, to our Treasury and how our financial mechanisms are set up, and so on. And so perhaps one of the most interesting governance arrangements that have been set up is a mission control board, which is essentially a central, almost like a kind of country platform. Country platforms are talked about a lot in the climate context. It's effectively like our own clean power country platform that is helping ensure that we have really high qualities of coordination across all those different departments and arm's length bodies and critical players in the system, that we're bringing into the conversation at every single stage the views of the developers and of the private finance community, so we're not missing tricks there. That ministers have real-time data on exactly how things are going, and that problems are spotted and resolved quite quickly. There's a direct route into number 10 in the Prime Minister's office as well. So that is a really interesting innovation, I think, and it potentially provides a further example where by not simply setting ambition, but by walking the talk and sort of leading by doing, if I can put it that way, we can help other countries emulate that sort of a model in the way that suits them. Which I think is going to be really, really key, because fundamentally it is a huge coordination challenge. I guess the other part of this is this isn't simply a climate agenda anymore. This is fundamentally a security of supply agenda and a growth agenda. If you listen to my Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, he will be very clear that the reason there has been sort of challenges with energy pricing in the UK is because, not despite our dependence on foreign imports of gas. And it's that challenge that we need to get away from. Shifting to a more secure form of homegrown clean power is critical for our security supply as well as for our climate goals. And then when you look at the growth agenda around that, our green economy sector is growing far faster than any other part of our economy. I think I saw in 2023 it was something like 9% growth. If you compare that to the average, that is something like 90 times higher than it was in the average. So I think we've seen the volume of investments nearly double in 3 years in the green economy. The number of jobs that are being employed now is well over 500 million and rapidly growing. So this is becoming, it's a mission that's not solely about our climate goals, although that's clearly part of it. It's also about our security supply, and it's also about the future of our economy. And I think there's a learning in there, an insight for other countries to sort of why are these what can seem like competing objectives together, and actually they can be incredibly powerfully mutually reinforcing when done well. The only other thing we can come on to maybe in due course, how that emulates internationally, but there are really powerful levers to try and help countries develop their own equivalent high-quality NDC plans that we are backing. For example, the NDC partnership, which I know is trying to help other countries develop high-quality NDC plans and investable plans and actionable plans for their 2035 NDCs, and indeed as they take forward their 2030 NDCs. So the importance of not simply demonstrating ambition, providing examples of how you can deliver in practice, but also narrowing the gap between those examples and insights that are developed in one country and be able to share them and deploy them in other countries, I think is going to be a real part of the trick as we look to the next 5 years of working towards the 2030 GST goals. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your concrete examples and cases, and I guess that through these so-called platform, which is not exactly a platform, you are able to attract and to matchmaking investors and also those that want to finance those investments, and so really to change the reality. And another takeaway that I will also highlight is the positive messaging. So we've heard a lot, at least I've heard a lot throughout this week, that let's focus much more on the positive end of this transition than on the costs. Mark, would you agree that those kind of mechanisms are critical to drive market approach investments and to really further engage with the private sector? So this is one question. European Union has been known for its very thought leadership on regulatory-driven policies. And while it is absolutely important, it is also sometimes seen as a slowdown on, I would say, the risk appetite for private actors. So how to balance the two within the climate agenda?
Yes, quite a number of questions. On the first, yes, indeed, the approach of the European Union on getting to the climate targets is on the one hand relying very much on the pricing mechanism, but at the same time, a sort of belts and braces approach, have also a large set of technical regulations. The Green Deal, as it was called, it was launched in 2019. If you look at it, if you look now back, I think at least 25 pieces of legislation were passed in order to get to your minus 55% target. So not only carbon pricing, but also a number of technical regulations. To give you one example, we have a ban on the sales of cars with internal combustion engines by 2035. We have regulations on minimum levels of electrical charging along motorways. We have a renewable energy directive obliging member states to reach a certain minimum level of renewable energy by 2030. So it is a complementary approach. On the one hand, the invisible hand of the market and the visible hand of regulation. On top of that, in order to keep the system not only environmentally or economically sustainable, but also politically sustainable, climate policy has been flanked by measures that you could put under the heading of industrial policy and of trade policy. Under industrial policy, in February of this year, the European Union launched the Clean Industrial Deal, how to marry the green transition with competitiveness. Because the good news is that there is a lot of technological progress in the world, The not so good news is that most of it is coming from China, and if we don't watch out, we will get wiped out. We were wiped out on solar panels. We are not doing too well on wind turbines. We are being wiped out in batteries. And so many people say, well, you know, if the future is green but an industrial wasteland, sorry, I'm not going to sign up for that. So how do you combine competitiveness and the green transition? And that is very much at the heart of the Clean Industrial Deal. Similarly, there is the issue of trade policy. I think the EU wants to stay a very open economy and wants to distance itself from what is sometimes called green protectionism. At the same time, there is this competitiveness issue. And so we have now two pieces of legislation that are highly controversial in the rest of the world, but that I think deep down are climate measures. That is the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the deforestation regulation. Carbon leakage is an issue, especially when your carbon price gets over 70 euros a ton, and in all likelihood will be getting over 100 euros a ton. Then for a number of sectors like cement, steel, and what have you, there is a carbon leakage issue, and you've got to address it, and there are only two ways. One is to give allowances for free, which is what we have been doing until now, but that flies in the face of one of the cardinal principles of environmental policy, namely the polluter pays, or you've got to have carbon border adjustment. I mean, there are not 10 ways to skin the cat. There are only two. Free or carbon border adjustment. Finally, I think indeed that in order to get more implementation worldwide, there is a lot of mileage in comparing notes. What works, what doesn't. I know that my former colleagues are now doing a lot of work on what I could call carbon market diplomacy. The EU has set up a task force of 12, 15 economists and engineers traveling around the world, extolling the virtues of carbon pricing. We've been doing a lot of work with China. There's a lot of work happening with Brazil. What are the sort of things to do to set up a stable carbon pricing mechanism? How to move from carbon intensity to absolute values, these sorts of things. I do believe indeed that there is a lot of learning that can happen without getting into questions of rivalry.
This is very good and positive. I guess that we have to end. I would have another question, but we don't have time, which is, so I hope that the next panels will be able, it would have been the question around what would be a successful COP30. But I guess that the answer would be too long. So I would like to thank you very much, Ed and Mark, and I want to end on a very positive note that, you know, the climate debate has now gone into security supply debate, growth agenda, industrial, trade, and finance. So we are now all over. Thank you very much for taking the time for this conversation.
And thank you for the speakers. Let me just ask for a quick photo of the speakers. So if you could just sit behind your seats, just take a photo. No, you can sit. That's you. Or in the front. Yeah, that's not ideal, but I think it's better than nothing. Thank you so much. And now I'm calling for the next panel on delivering finance for climate action. Rob Moore, the Associate Director of Public Banks and Development at E3G. Welcome, Rob. Thais Ferraz, Programmatic Director at the Institute for Climate and Sustainability, IX. David Harris, Head of Sustainable Finance Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at London Stock Exchange Group. And Russell Bishop, Head of Sustainable Finance Policy for European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Thank you all. For those who are up, thank you for your patience. There are a few seats on the left, so if you want to go around and try to find the seats on the left, there are 2 or 3 over there. Yes, yeah. There's on the if you don't mind taking it on the side. There's a coffee room, and then there's water and everything for you. Yeah, on the right next side.
Hi everyone, we're about to start, so I'm trying to think of the right way of saying. So I'm Rob Moore. I'm the Associate Director of Public Banks and Development for E3G. And this panel, we'll try and pick up the challenge of talking about what a successful COP30 needs. But we'll web that through the lens of finance, and I'm sure that we'll continue it on in the third panel on sectoral engagement, because I guess that's what we're all aiming for. Before we start, I just want to say a few framing words. So we know that one of the big challenges facing the Brazilian COP30 presidency this year is the mobilization of climate finance. Obviously, always at the heart of the climate negotiations. I was formerly led the UK's climate finance team during the COP26 presidency. E3G published a report earlier this week called Getting on the Path to 1.3 trillion, where we worked very closely with the Brazilian Finance Ministry and a lot of other really wise minds, including some of the institutions on the panel here, to pull together a set of actions that we think are actually deliverable this year, even in a time of tumultuous politics, to get on the path to international finance mobilization to the level that we know that we need. So the Climate Policy Initiative published a report earlier this week with the updated figures around the state of climate finance, which found that firstly, overall climate finance flows had reached $1.9 trillion, which is the highest level that we've ever seen. And of those, for the first time in emerging and developing economies, those flows were over the threshold of $1 trillion per year, which is not where they need to be, but it's a good step forward from where we have been in previous years. And we sorted those proposals into 5 broad buckets, which I think one thing that we're really eager to explore with the panel is how these things actually all sit together. So often when you speak to governments, you find a tendency to say, oh, we must prioritize, we can only do 2 or 3 things at any one time. There's a lot of people that work for governments, and you think you can probably do more than 2 or 3 things, but they're all also very interconnected. So we bucketed things between fiscal space, improving financial and prudential regulation, improving the effectiveness of the delivery architecture so that it's more coordinated and impactful, scaling public finance, including, and we'll hear from Russell, including the important role of the multilateral development banks, but also the climate funds. And then finally, ensuring that we've got an effective multilateral engagement architecture. So I'm sure that anyone that's been to a COP hears a lot of frustration around the nature of the climate finance negotiations and the fact that they're not focused on the problem at hand, and they often turn into a lot of sort of divisive political debate, which is often quite justified because there are real justice issues when we talk about climate finance, but we also need to focus pragmatically on the potential solutions that we have at hand. So I encourage all of you to read that report. Very happy to come back into King's College to talk about it in more detail. Lily in the audience was one of the lead authors of it, so I'm going to point her out and make her blush. But importantly, I want to hear some perspectives from the panel. I'm going to start with Russell, and just to say, we're going to go through a round of questions and try and keep it quite pithy and to the point, and hopefully have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I'm also conscious that we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to look towards you, and if we run over, just give me a signal. So Russell, firstly, the role of the multilateral development banks, everybody acknowledges, is very important. EBRD has been doing a lot of work in this space. You are, at the moment, thinking about your future green economic transition strategy, and it's been a few years since you wrote the last one. A lot has changed in the world. Both the evolution of the architecture is much more sophisticated, but also the politics are quite tricky. And there's a lot of questions around what is the right role of concessional finance and the right role of the public finance institutions in driving change. Could you just talk a little bit about the work that EBRD is doing, what we should expect from your updated strategy, and how that plays into some of these bigger questions around financing?
That's okay. Thanks, Rob, and thanks for everyone for coming today to talk about this and engage in this. Look, our current green strategy in the EBRD is called the Green Economy Transition Strategy, and I think that speaks to what has been coming out of this week and is clear that the deep interconnection between green issues, climate issues, and economic prosperity. And this is something that we're well aware of at the EBRD as a multilateral development bank focused on the private sector. In terms of what we're focused on going forward in the context of the challenges that we clearly face and the need to scale up, there's kind of three elements to what we're focused on. The first is we want to increase the quantity of finance that we support, and that means a heavier focus on private sector mobilization. We invest about 16 billion euros a year of our own account. About half of it is green, just over half of that is green. That is clearly not enough in the context of our countries of operation, around 45 countries, where the needs are in the order of about 500 billion. So it's very clear that the real task for EBRD is how do we use our limited amount of funds and our limited activities to be able to create the type of opportunities that mean that we'll end up with financial flows like that. So the first area is increasing the amount of money that we're putting into the system. The second area is focus on enabling markets, and maybe I can get into this a bit later on, given you requested to be pithy, but we really need to make sure that we are doing things alongside investments which really support market enabling activities. And you know, a key one for us, for example, is transition plans. I know that's something that's been spoken a lot about this week. Take-up is very low in the EBRD countries of operation, and that's an area that we'll be focused on going forward. Third area is we need to do much more on adaptation in nature. This is not a climate crisis. This is obviously one that's much broader. And historically, our investment activity and our market activities have been quite focused on climate mitigation, and we know we need to do more there. So they're the key elements.
That was really pithy. I'm just gonna, before we move on, I am going to double down on two things. One, on that point around doing more on private mobilization, there are a lot of ideas circling around how the MDBs can potentially do more. I just wondered if you could if you were to pull out a sort of highlight reel, what are the one or two initiatives or the incentive structures that we hear about so much? As you know, we need to reform incentives, we need to reform how shareholders view the bank so that they're incentivizing the right actions and activities. What would you see there? And then I am going to come back on transition plans, because E3G, we housed the transition plan task force that developed the guidance in the UK for transition planning. And I think one thing that we really see is that it's a big challenge to understand sustainable finance in a context-specific way. So how do emerging market transition pathways align to sustainable finance disclosures in the West? And that's a really big, crunchy question, and you guys are really at the heart of some of those conversations with your client countries. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the work that you're doing in that transition planning space too, and then we'll move on.
Okay, so let me give two examples to address each one of those. Like maybe a practical way that MDBs can mobilise finance. An example is we are working across 16, well, nearly 20 countries of operation around renewable energy auctions. So we're structuring auctions of renewable capacity, inviting the private sector, and basically using this as a model that can be scaled up with repeat to help support governments. But this is key because often this will be the first auction in a country. You build the capacity, you invite the private sector, you overcome constraints to investment in the structuring of the auctions. It's a fabulous kind of example of the way to mobilize finance at scale, but also build the capacity to do it, you know, over the long term. And there's many other examples like that. That's quite a sort of very practical one. On transition plans and how do we build this in? How do we kind of build this into our day-to-day work in emerging markets? We've pushed quite a lot over the last few years in issuing the first sustainability-linked loans in our countries of operation, and this often involves a kind of obviously corporate-level targets and pathways that need to reflect local circumstances. And what we're often observing there is that the policy frameworks are not in place and the signals are not in place, and taking the kind of international benchmarks just are not appropriate in different geographies. And we kind of work through that with a client, but certainly more thinking and more work on that is needed, and we are also contributing to that.
Great, thanks, Russ. I'm going to pivot over to Thijs, and again in Russ's spirit of pithy and pointedness. I wanted to ask you about the role, and I know that IX is working very closely with the Brazilian COP30 presidency in particular. who are facing a huge challenge, pointing to the earlier question that the last panel didn't get time to talk about, which is a successful COP30, is we have seen a lot of development cuts from a lot of donor countries in the last couple of years, and there is a big challenge around how we improve the coordination of the supply of concessional finance so that it is, whilst we rebuild the foundations for sort of political confidence to provide international support, how do we make what's available go further? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit around how you see both the role of philanthropy, but also in general, how we can make sure that we are using concessional finance as effectively as possible and using the donor finance that is still available, which is less than we would like it to be, as impactfully as we can, especially for decarbonisation, but feel free to also talk about nature and adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, good afternoon, good morning, sorry. I think that it is always important to come back to the road, the Baku-Belém, that this is the working that is in pace now. So we need to build what is the road, you know, how we will achieve 1.3 trillion. And for this, we need to mobilize private capital. And that's the main role of concessional. And I think it is very illustrative if we bring the example of nature here. So, for example, we have a huge potential to restore a lot of areas, and bringing Brazil to as a case, we have like 100 million of degraded areas in Brazil. We have the goal to recover 40 million hectares of degraded areas, and it is impossible to do this only with concessional money and donations. So that's the thing. But we know that we can have investments, but it is not an easy task because, for example, if you want to invest in a restoration project, the market sees as a too risky project. So that's the reason that we need to bring concessional investment. And the most important thing is how we align this kind of investments in a road and understanding that it is fundamental to have NBS as part of the solution. So we know that we will not be able to achieve the goals for mitigation and adaptation if we do not consider nature-based solutions. So that's the case. And to leverage nature-based solutions, we need all the structures. So, as I mentioned, concessional capital, and then all the flow. For example, in Brazil, we have a fund that is called EcoInvest, that is an instrument that you know, it is a blended fund that do the protection for the hedge fund, and it is aligned with the ecological transition plan, and it is connected with the NDC goals. So, and it is also connected with the road Baku-Belém. So I think that this alignment between different instruments and policies, this is fundamental.
Great, thank you. And I think a lot of the work coming out of Brazil, both on the nature side, but also the work that BNDES is doing on the energy transition. Mm-hmm. And we've heard a lot about that in the UK this week because of the partnership with the Green Finance Institute and the UK's Global Clean Power Alliance. Is sort of a really impactful story as well. But so many challenges that are nature specific also, and the need to find ways of financing them. We talked a little bit about the importance of coordination and coherence, and that's particularly true for institutional investors. Luckily, we have somebody that can speak to that. So, David, I wondered if you could talk a little bit around the work that the London Stock Exchange Group is doing, and in particular, I think one thing that's really come out as a common refrain this week, and Thijs, some of your comments alluded to it, is we need to work together as an ecosystem, and clarity and consistency and systematic working is really important so that the private sector and the concessional finance that's available is speaking to the same hymn sheet. How do we do that?
Great, thanks, Rob. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Maybe by kind of to start off with, just to kind of, maybe it's worth explaining who we are. Obviously, people know about the exchange, and that's an important part of our group, and obviously helps with kind of capital raising of for whether it's green bonds, whether it's kind of climate-focused companies kind of listing in London, helping kind of guide companies in terms of their kind of reporting and indeed their transition plans. But that's around about 10% of the company. So the other parts, we've got the index business, FTSE Russell, so that's helping provide the indexes and the benchmarks that institutional investors use to structure their investing. We have our data and analytics division, and we actually went from about 5,000 people to 25,000 people just a few years ago, and that was the Thomson Reuters financial data business that came together with LSEG. So we are now very much of a very global business, across 60 countries, majority of revenue North America, majority of staff Asia. So we're really kind of a financial data market infrastructure organization. But this is kind of relevant, kind of really 3 points which interconnect with, I think, the role that we can play. I have got a kind of case study of, I think, a really inspiring action, but if I don't get to that, then we'll maybe pick up later. But the first was really that institutional investors are actually really serious about climate change, particularly the asset owners, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds. The implication of whether the world is on a 2-degree, 3-degree, or 4-degree trajectory has obviously massive investment implications, and so very long-term orientated capital and investors, are focused on those big issues. And at the same time, there's also an incredible investment opportunity here. We were talking about China and just the incredible opportunity that the industrial transition to a low-carbon economy represents. To kind of give some kind of stats on that, we do a survey each year of asset owners, largest 300 asset owners globally. We've been doing it now for about 10 years. About 5 years ago, we reached the point where over half of them were saying they were trying to integrate sustainability and climate issues. It's a little kind of niche market over here. This is a macro theme that pretty much every institutional investor is trying to deal with. So that's the kind of the first point. The second is I would say there are 4 categories of climate transition finance, and most of them don't require concessionary capital, or not that much of it. One of them really does. These were and I think if we're going to hit the kinds of numbers which we had, obviously the 300 billion target that was set at COP29, and the desire to try and triple that with triple or quadruple it with private capital, and to achieve that, we need to kind of work out where does that concessionary capital play and where is it less needed. The 4 categories is climate solutions. So this is the clean stuff. These are the products and services which are going to help us solve the challenges. We calculate that's about the market capitalization just of the equity market from those clean solution side is about 8 trillion, and the growth rate is 15% CAGR, the compound annual growth rate over the last decade. So this would be, if you saw it as a traditional sector, this would be the second best performing sector after technology. So it's highly volatile, but there's a lot of complexity in it, but the underlying growth rate is immense. So I should also on the IEA figures are here, obviously quite interesting as well. Where back in 2016 it was about 1 trillion going into clean energy, about 1 trillion going into fossil fuel energy. You roll that forward to today, and it's now 3.3 trillion going into clean energy versus 1.1 into fossil fuel energy. So it's about a 3-to-1 ratio, but it's also worth noticing that it hasn't gone down, the amount of fossil fuel investments. It's just that clean has come up. And when we're looking at that kind of clean investments, the vast majority of that is going into developed markets and China. If you take them out, it's only 15% coming to other markets. So, but anyway, I think that is an area though which doesn't require actually that much concessionary capital. Then you've got kind of what we call kind of aligned and aligning. So this is kind of basically kind of sectors of the economy which kind of need to decarbonize. We need those products and services, but there needs to be kind of business model shifts, and what are the emissions reductions that each company in each sector needs to try to achieve. And if we get onto it later, I can talk maybe some interesting case studies about how investors are trying to kind of drive action and change there. The third is or sorry, I should say fourth, because that's the second and third. The fourth would be then phase out and phase down. So these are particularly coal at the moment, but obviously other sectors coming up in the future. And that's obviously where we do need concessionary capital. Things like CBAM, potentially if you can have effective carbon markets and get carbon markets to do that as well. But how do we fund the early kind of close down effectively of coal-powered energy generation? And so, there's 5,000 coal-powered plants in Asia Pacific. Many of them are relatively new. So that is a huge challenge. My third and final point is on corporate climate reporting is needed to inform investment and finance decision making, and getting onto transition plans, forward-looking information is particularly important to be able to make sure that we're kind of directing capital appropriately. And that also connects in with NDCs and national transition planning. So to make investment decisions, investors need information. We're way better than where we were 10 years ago. If you look at the largest 4,000 companies now, 70% of them are now reporting on things like their carbon emissions. That still means there's 30% though that aren't. And actually, so we've been a big advocate of ISSB. This is the International Sustainability Standards Board and the implementation there. But we also need that forward-looking information, and that's where the transition plans piece is so important. And so we've been, we're really pleased that the UK has now got the 3 consultations finally moving on this. We've got the ISSB consultation on implementation here. We've got also the consultation on transition plans. Look at that, respond to it is really important. But also on sustainability assurance was the third part there. But we've got 36 countries now moving on implementation of ISSB, but we need that consistent information to make sure that the institutional investments can be driven in a really efficient way. But also that links to the point on NDCs, companies and finance can't do it alone. It's got to be that connection with governments and government transition planning and government industrial strategies here too. And it's that connection between the three which is so important. So the NDCs as we head up to COP30 being really important. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes. Yeah, we'll do that. I'm gonna, rather than hog the mic, I'm gonna put a few cross-cutting points, but then open to the audience, and feel free to either address or don't address these points when you respond to audience questions. One is, I think we do see a lot, and it builds on, I think, all of your comments, a need for the development finance sector to pivot from a world that is mostly focused on actual investment to one that's focused on de-risking and increasing churn. And there's some interesting proposals around that, including more securitization, more use of guarantees, but all of that requires a cohesive system. And you all bring different sort of perspectives on the important bits of that, so I would be really interested in your thoughts on that. The second is there's a groundswell of momentum around country platforms that risks either being pure rhetoric or something truly impactful, and how can we make sure it's the latter? And I do think, especially ties, Brazil is in such a great place with such a good case study of doing things well. What do you need in terms of response from the international community? And the third is, if we do everything right, we do also still need more concessional finance. And in the current politics, where is that going to come from? One thing that we put into our report that we put out earlier this week is both the work of the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force on the IMO and aviation taxation, which is, it really feels like there's some momentum behind it. And these are very tricky things to actually pull off. But also, just because we talked about it in the last panel, the use of CBAM and the revenues that CBAM generates. And actually, those aren't general taxation on European taxpayers, the levies on imports. And so shouldn't we be having a conversation around, even though it's not a lot of money, but all the pressure that the EU is getting and the UK will be getting too, about these being unilateral trade measures? Well, shouldn't we be talking about how we recycle those revenues and actually double down on how we use that money and put it to good use to achieve its primary objective? A couple of provocations, but we'll open to audience questions. Feel free to either disregard mine or come back on them when you come back. But I wanted to open the floor and get some participation. So please raise your hand and we'll bring in. Otherwise, we'll revert to the questions that I asked. Yeah.
Because when I was watching all the panels and the answers, this idea of like climate justice and how do we make sure that there is real benefit sharing with the community and that all of those initiatives result in actual improving the quality of lives of people and in their, you know, reduction of cost of living. Otherwise, we know that more right-wing governments will be elected, which then defeats a lot of the efforts that are being done now. So how do we create this into a positive loop of like shared prosperity, which then upholds democracy? Because for me, that's the worry with all of this, is that we're still siphoning too much of the benefit into private hands.
Great, thanks. Can I just see if we have any other questions before we...
Yes, a question on the need for private capital or companies to engage on nature-based solutions. I think for many companies, what can make a difference and how can you create solutions that make it possible for companies to do that in a credible way?
Great, thanks. We'll take one more, if anyone's got one, and then we'll probably have time to just do a quick round of responses. So final call, any... Yes, at the back.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm from Brazil. I'd like to know how I'm thinking about how to move the investments that are with the security and war that is considered zero net in the whole Convention of Climate in green solutions instead of gray solutions.
Yeah, thank you. And we were thinking a bit about that, you know, with a lot of pledges to spend 5% of GDP on defense, but maybe not tackle a very primary cause of instability feels a bit silly. So we've got three questions there. One on how we consolidate this sort of, you know, private sector focused vision with the just transition. I think it's a really, really important point. How do we get money into nature-based solutions, and then the final point on sort of security and how we address that. Why don't we just go in turn, all three? Feel free to respond to both my points and the points from the audience, and then we'll close.
Thanks, Rob. What I may do to try and draw a thread a bit through the different questions is talk a bit about what the MDBs are practically doing to address some of this and speak to the EBRD experience. I mean, one thing you said there, Rob, was, you know, the MDBs have been good at counting investments, but maybe not so much the impact of what those investments are and whether they add up to the type of impacts that we need. So the MDBs have released a framework which is really geared towards this, i.e. moving away from counting the inputs and working out what has been the outputs and the outcomes of this, of the actual work of the MDBs. And that's a big step for us, because I mean that's ultimately what you need to communicate, is all of this adding up to a bigger prize. And that's out in the public domain, but in EBRD we're really thinking hard about how to do that. On the country platforms, there's a couple that I'll shine a light on in the MDBs. This is again an area of work that the MDBs are quite focused on. One is in Egypt, which where, you know, this is completely necessary to bring the government, the private sector, civil society, investors round the table and work out what needs to be done. If it's not that, I'm not sure what the alternative is. There's another one that I'll shine a light on in North Macedonia, which I think speaks to the just transition point, where a key kind of policy issue is the phase out of coal, and what to do with the communities and workers that are reliant on employment and that's both at coal mines, the coal-fired power stations, and in the supply chain. And that's a key feature of the country platform, is how to address that challenge. So it's the scaling down of fossil fuels, but also, of course, what you can do to scale up. We have this in different forms. I mean, in the EBRD, we have something called we have a Green Cities program, which basically almost acts like a country platform downscaled to the level of a city, where you work with the government, or EBRD works with the government to say, well, what policy reforms and investments do you need to put in over the long term, triggered by an EBRD investment. So there's a kind of trigger investment which does this, but it allows you to a sort of entry point into a strategic discussion around what needs to be done in the long term.
I really like that idea of, like, the MDBs are on the both literal and allegorical coalface of a lot of this, and I think creating that dialogue with policy practitioners on what is and isn't working on the ground and what the actual challenge. Certainly when I was in government, that was something that we always struggled with, is just how do you actually get policymakers to actually hear the difficulties of practical implementation. It's not always easy. Thijs, I wondered if in particular you could also respond in general, but also pick up the point on nature-based solutions. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, we have a question about scale and how to bring private sector for nature-based solutions, and someone brought the social dimension of it. And I think that there are two topics. One is, a lot of times we do not have the required scale. So a solution for this is creating some, groups of projects. For example, the country platform is looking exactly what are the solutions and how we can have a investable pipeline of projects. And some of them, they are not ready to be investable, but then we have to work with enabling conditions. So we need to have different mechanisms and some different funds, for example, with smaller projects, so in this way they can achieve a different scale in the future. And this is the only way that we can work, for example, with smaller projects that has the social dimension stronger. And for example, in nature-based solutions, we have social bioeconomy, and they have a totally different scale, but they are very important, to provide some income for people who lives in the forest. But we cannot use the same instruments, because they have a totally different scale, and we need much more concessional capital in these cases. But different solutions and different instruments for different projects. I think that what is key is that we need to have exactly this kind of structure. For example, the country platform, and then we have other initiatives, like we've been working with some groups and some labs in Brazil. EcoInvest, that is an instrument, trying to address the challenge of the hedge funding. That is a real challenge for us. So I think that this ecosystem view, that is the key.
And that small-scale challenge is both adaptation and nature, right? So
exactly,
big ticket, and the MDBs are very well set up for that, but a bit more challenging when you get into the weeds of smaller-scale projects. David, I'm going to come to you for final closing remarks, so feel free to come back on all of the above. But I would in particular, one thing that's been a cross-cutting point this week is the importance of data and reliable data. And I wondered if you could maybe say a few words. I know that the Stock Exchange Group is doing a lot of work on data transparency, etc. So not to put you on the spot, but I just did. So.
Okay, I'll come back on data, but that's in some ways more the sweet spot. But I thought I'd actually pick up kind of the last question and link it with your question on the concessionary capital and where's it going to come from? Because I think part of the issue is that some of the concessionary capital hasn't been directed as well as it could have been. I think there's a bunch of stuff which actually private finance can largely deal with. And so I think that's one part of it. But it's, and I should also say with that last question also, with, in an era of kind of increasing, not just war, but kind of trade tariffs and challenges between countries, actually, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is really interesting and is really potentially powerful. It's not just about the money it can raise. It's about really directing capital in a really efficient way to deal with the most carbon-intense areas and help them decarbonize. So if it and so maybe just to double down a bit on CBAM. So where you've got, obviously you've got a lot of concerns from targets when they're competing with stuff outside of their borders which aren't facing it. So it's a really nice mechanism to say to countries, you've got to have an equivalent pricing mechanism in your country in order to be able to not to hit these tariffs. Once you do that, that country is then going to be putting in place a mechanism which is brilliant for linking kind of capital, because lots of companies will find it quite hard to decarbonise. It's going to be expensive to do so. You'll get little emissions reductions in a range of places. It's going to be cheaper for them to pay for that coal-powered utility to be closed down. And then actually you don't need so much concessionary capital because these markets then can start taking care of it. So that was, I think, so big fan of CBAM, and I think it could be a big solution for some of this. On the question on data, data, there is enough data for action by investors and finance. It's not an excuse for inaction. There's plenty of information available and good modeled information which we and our peers provide. At the same time, it's not being directed as efficiently as it could be. So we do need better data, and that's why we came together. People might think lots of companies don't want to do reporting. We're hearing in the EU all the pushback on CSRD. A lot of companies are very happy to report, but they want to do it once. They don't want to do it in a whole myriad of different ways across all these different reporting standards, which become a nightmare. And investors don't want these myriad of different reporting standards, because then it's like, you can't compare the data because that company's reporting it in a different way to that company. So this is why the International Sustainability Standards Board is so important. We've got to have consistent information. We need that consistent baseline globally, and why it's so important that every government around the world starts implementing that. So last year we came together with the PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and also a whole bunch of exchanges through the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative to say, we want every government to implement ISSB, and we want you to get going on it by 2025. This isn't like, finance wants this, business wants this, markets need this information to be able to work properly.
100%, and I think we also see the point on too much data being overwhelming, and if you have multiple versions of the truth, it becomes self-defeating. So how can we get to a world that's more simple, where you have single plans, single data sets? And one thing I would say to the MDBs is, the GEMS data set on emerging markets, and we know that the credit rating agencies are overestimating risk of the MDE investment, is a great tool. And then just on CBAM, I completely agree. My last job in government was leading the global carbon markets team, and the amount of requests that we got to actually support technical assistance when CBAM became a thing was astounding, and it really has animated interest. But I think that there's still an open question on the catalytic potential of revenues that you could use to double down on effectiveness. So it's more of it's a supplement of impact. Look, great. We've hopefully made a little bit of time back. I would like to really thank the panel for a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you for your questions too. And I imagine that CBAM may come up in the next session, given that we're talking about sectoral transitions and trade. So appears to be an unplanned common theme. But thank you. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you, panelists and Rob. I'll take a quick photo. Okay. So if you want to grab a glass of water, it's next door for the benefit of time, because we don't want to end too late and want to have you ready for lunch. I already called the second panel while people go and get their drinks. So I'm calling Rafaela Guedes. Rafaela is Senior Fellow at CEBRI and Senior Consultant at APCO Worldwide. Welcome, Rafaela. We also have with us Joana Leme. Joana is Associate Director of Clean Economy at E3G. Then we also have the pleasure of having Hilde Rhodes, Senior Vice President of Climate and Sustainability at Equinor. We have Daniele Carreira, Head of Financing Sector Engagement, Tropical Forest Alliance at the World Economic Forum. Daniel is here. And then Roberto Vac. Welcome, Roberto. Member of the Board of Directors and Chair of the Sustainability Committee at Marfrig Global Foods SA.
Thank you. I think it has been a lovely, lovely conversation up to now because we started with the global level and then the country levels of the NDCs being established and the NDCs that have to be delivered, hopefully most of them before COP, the renewals. Then we had the opportunity to discuss within the sectoral levels and what each of the segments are doing. And now we'll get to the company level and understand within these segments how the companies are reacting or how the companies are really moving their targets, because on the end of the day, it's each individual company doing and moving forward that will guarantee that from the bottom up, we have these NDCs really delivered. So with that, I think that within anywhere in the world, if we try to segment in many countries, and this is the case for Brazil, land use and deforestation is a big thing, and of course then the cities and the others. But so here we will have representatives that will be able to speak upon these different challenges within the industry and energy, within the land uses, and definitely with forests, and experts that will give us broader views of what's the big challenges. So Hild, I'll start with you, and I follow closely what Equinor is doing, but we would love to understand within the carbon efficiency and with the phasing out or phasing down of fossil fuels towards a net carbon a net world. What would be the main things that you think that Equinor is being able to, but besides the things, what are the challenges, the hurdles, and what is the concrete actions we can expect?
Well, thank you. Lots of good questions there, and great to be here. I represent Equinor, and just a little bit context first for those who don't know us that well. We're an energy company headquartered in Norway. The Norwegian government is the largest shareholder, but we have many other shareholders as well. And we have been producing mainly oil and gas for 50 years, the largest producer of oil and gas on the Norwegian continental shelf. And I think that's important because the context we've discussed today is when climate meets affordability and competitiveness issues, but also energy security. Because Norway is, after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the largest supplier of gas to Europe, supplies more than a third, and we're by far the largest supplier of gas to UK. And I think Norwegian gas plays a quite important role as baseload also in the transition in the UK. And for us, this role to be really a sort of reliable and stable energy provider to Europe while transitioning, I think comes with a lot of opportunities, but also some challenges and dilemmas, or even trilemmas, as we call them. We have a very clear strategy to diversify, to become a broad energy company. We're still very much dominated by oil and gas, but we do have activities in offshore wind, several projects here in the UK, and also carbon capture and storage, to mention some. And we do have a net zero roadmap, but we have been clear all the time that our way of transitioning is not just shutting down things, it's about delivering energy, but with lower emissions. Because I think it's really important when we talk about decarbonizing the energy sector that we do not forget that energy is so crucial to everyday life everywhere in the world. We launched a transition plan in 2022, very interesting time. That was around the time of the invasion of Ukraine. At that time, there was very much focus on climate and climate policies. 3 years later, we have updated and we still have a very consistent strategy, but of course with some adjustments. But it's interesting to watch the debate because the security focus is so high, but also the profitability challenges we've seen in parts of the renewable space, etc. So how do you combine really the competitiveness, the security, and decarbonization? That's the core of our plan. And I think to really have a good discussion about transition of the energy sector, we need to know the facts. We need to know that, yes, investments in renewable energy are blooming, and that's fantastic, particularly in solar and in batteries. Double the amount of fossil fuels last year, and I think for a decade now have been bigger, and they should be. But yet, we're in a period of energy addition and not energy transition, because the world's energy need is growing tremendously at the same time, with more people being lifted out of poverty, and we have also a digitalization issue. So it's a moving target in a way. We're trying to decarbonize something that is still 80% based on fossil fuels, that is essential for people's lives, and it's growing, the demand is growing. So it's not an easy task, and that's why there are no easy answers either. So knowing and understanding that complexity, and maybe we should talk a little bit less about transitioning away and a little bit more about transitioning to. How do we build the alternatives? Because that's what you need to really transition. So what do we do as a company? We still produce a lot of oil and gas. We take pride in doing that with the lowest possible carbon footprint. Around 10% of the world's emissions today comes from production of oil and gas, and there's still going to be a lot of oil and gas for many, many years to come. Then it does matter whether you manage to reduce those emissions, including the methane footprint. And that's an area where we have a lot of leadership and also share with partners. And then it's about building the alternatives. For us, it's using our competence in offshore operations, etc., building out offshore wind in particular. And we're involved in several projects here, but Dogger Bank is, of course, a project that we take a lot of pride in and hopefully will be at full production this year in the UK. That was the world's largest offshore wind farm. We also have very big projects, one in the US, Empire Wind. We have Baltic and Poland, etc. But we have seen that profitability is really a challenge in the offshore wind industry. And to have the scale needed, you really need profitability. That's the only way you will get the private sector to really engage. So that needs to be fixed. And then I just want one last thing to mention. Carbon capture and storage, I think there are many different views and been a lot of debates around that. Last week, I watched from my office a ship sailing out the Oslo fjord to pick up CO2 at Heidelberg cement factory outside of Oslo. It's being shipped and it's now being injected into safe permanent storage at the Norwegian continental shelf. That's the first of a kind. It's an open source CO2 storage. Not for oil and gas, but for all the hard-to-abate sectors, and also to help European industry decarbonize. Cement, steel, etc. So if renewables is not the answer to everything, neither is CCS, but what you really need is to work on a lot of these tools. So that's how we work on it. There are a lot of hurdles too, but I can probably come back to those in the next round.
Definitely, and I will want you afterwards. I'm an enthusiast of the carbon captures. They can be biogenic or from the fuels, and they are super important. So I really believe in them, and probably I will explore that. And within the hurdles, I think that one thing that we'll hear from everybody, and then London Stock Exchange is here and other financiers, is how do we really get to different kinds of business models that help us enhance and accelerate the transition. Yeah. Because as you said, what we have been seeing is just addition. It hasn't been really about a transition. So these points are super important. Roberto, now I'll come to you as a representative of MAFIG and BRF. For those who don't know, one of the biggest companies in agriculture and cattle. So agriculture sector is extremely important. Land use is extremely important. BRF has has done extremely high commitments to net zero before 2050. So we would love to hear a bit more of the concrete actions, and there's been a lot done in the territory. So please, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. It's working? Oh, yeah. So it's a really pleasure to me to be here with you now. It's really an enormous pleasure to represent Marfrig BRF together with Marcela Molina. She's a member of the Sustainability Committee of the company for the last 4 years. Well, Marfrig BRF is one of the largest multi-protein global player in the world. We have something like 80 different processes, units all over the planet, and with a presence in more than 100 different countries. So one of the, let's say, 12 largest food producing company in the planet. And since 2009, we announced the commitment to be zero deforestation, but not only zero deforestation. So that was a very long way to go. Establishing a very solid and concrete traceability system. So nowadays we deal with 6 pillars. The first one is this origin control, so traceability directly and indirectly, so scope 1, 2, and 3. So this is one of the major challenges in Brazil, is to assure indirectly traceability systems. So that is one of the most important pillars on everything we do in terms of sustainability, but not only. A company also is strongly committed on science and methodologies for measuring carbon footprint, which is also something very tricky when you consider the whole supply chain, including indirectly players. So measurement of carbon footprint, especially considering methane, is something also very tricky. But another front, which is as important as climate change, is animal welfare. So the trends in the planet on protein consumption is taking more and more attention into this area of animal welfare. So this is one of the key pillars for Marfrig. And of course, natural resources, water, energy usage, and management of all this effluents and everything. So this is part of our program as well. And finally, social responsibility. In what concerns traceability, which is, let's say, the key topic in Europe, we have in our supply chain territory more than 30 million hectares of land, more than 10,000 suppliers. A lot of them are small producers, which is a huge challenge in terms of social inclusion, especially when the world puts a huge pressure on territories. For instance, Amazon-free cattle, which is something that we understand, but basically that generates an exclusion factor. And of course, we need to include Amazon into the supply chain, otherwise people will be in the hands of the narco traffic, for instance. So this is a big challenge for a company like Marfrig, but we are dealing with that. So every year we include in this system something like 3,000 new farmers, helping them on technical assistance, on legalizing the land and the compliance with forest code, this type of thing. So the livestock chain in Brazil is very complex. You know, have at least 3 tiers, so breeding, rearing, and finishing. So they are not well organized, and basically the market in Brazil is not an integrated market. The whole system is based on a spot transaction, which makes things even more complex. Nowadays we have this system that guarantee that 100% of the cattle we use are traceable. We work with a risk mitigation map, including every farm. So we deal with something like 5,000 transactions a day, everything under a data lake with information on risk level, and the basis of that operation for Mafrig is kind of a buffer of 200 kilometers considering the distance of the farm to the plants. So 200 kilometers is something that is reasonable considering the assurance of deforestation free. So this is one of the most sophisticated tool we use, which is satellite mapping, blockchain, all kinds of assuring methodologies on deforestation, but not only deforestation, including labor, including land ownership, including indigenous and quilombola lands, also take into consideration the monitoring, the official and non-official monitoring tools, basically the government tools, but also probably you're familiar with MAP biomas, one of the most interesting tools used by Brazilians, but not only Brazil. So we combine MAP biomas, which is a civil society tool, with the official tools in this satellite system, again using blockchain and data management and even artificial intelligence for that. A very important tool is the link of the supply chain with the environmental register in Brazil. This is one of the most interesting instruments that Brazil is also using. I used to say, no, the agribusiness sector in Brazil is responsible for 220 million hectares, which is about half of Central Europe size. Is by far the largest owners of conservation land in the planet. The second largest US with 10% of that. So this system, this agribusiness system, is responsible for huge territorial conservation. Of course, this is not yet valued by the agribusiness system. So one of the challenge we face and one of the initiatives we are trying to implement is what we call the nature positive process. So providing the supply chain, which we are dealing with the tools to assure that they are nature positive, including conservation, including, of course, neutrality in terms of emissions related to deforestation, but not only carbon measurement related to deforestation, but also, as I mentioned, methane emissions, all that. So we are nowadays the only company in the planet that can supply carbon neutral beef based on a protocol recognized by different organizations like SBTi and all that. So this is more or less what we are trying to do. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. And at the same time, so many challenges because of the sizes. Yeah. And one important takeaway that will lend me perfectly to you, Joanna, is that definitely BRF is integrated within the communities within Amazon, but even though it's within Amazon, it is possible to do so with traceability, considering the communities, and providing economical feasibility for the region. So this is super important, and providing ways that the legality, land use change, forestry is a huge part. It can be emitter, but at the same time it can be perfect carbon sinks if well used. So the Forest Alliance that is led by you within the World Economic Forum is doing a lot as well, and we would love to hear a bit about what are the main levers that you have been seeing, and at the same time the challenges to really scale it up.
So thank you. First I got to say that thanks for inviting me here, but it was really nice to come and see David. That's how my career in sustainable finance started nearly 20 years ago. So yeah, it was brilliant. Brought back a lot of memories. So the Tropical Forest Alliance, it is an initiative that sits within the World Economic Forum. And we were created over 10 years ago to help companies such as Mafrig, and I think Roberto mentioned here, to decouple their supply chain from land use change, from deforestation. It is a huge problem. It is a very complex problem. No company alone can resolve. No financier alone can resolve. And that's why we're created, to bring this multi-stakeholder approach to resolve the problem. I am a firm believer that, and when we talk about supply chain, we've got to stop talking about supply chain. We've got to talk about value chain. And we've got to think from the producer to governments. And that is one thing that, at the moment, very few people talk about and talk to, is to producers. They are the decision makers. They own the land. And if you don't talk to him, don't hear them, things are not going to change. And Roberto mentioned here the traceability issue. Cattle in Brazil is a highly complex issue. We, going beyond Brazil, we have palm oil as well in Indonesia. And when we think about, or Malaysia, when we think that 40% of palm oil is produced by smallholders, it's highly complex. Without that information, it's extremely complex. So, going back, Tropical Forest Alliance, we work with the traders, meat packers, soya traders, palm oil traders, with the consumer goods forum companies, which are retailers and manufacturers. And I joined 5 years ago to bring the financial sector for this conversation. And from the financial sector perspective, I think I'm seeing a lot of evolution. I started working with deforestation in 2012. It used to be a very little, small group of institutional investors looking pretty much at the palm oil sector. 2018 came, cattle and soya came to the radar. And what we have seen since then is a lot of regulations from consumer countries, such as the European Deforestation Regulation, the EUDR, which it is pushing the agenda. It is creating the ambition and the interest from the financial sector, from the private sector as a whole as well. It doesn't come without its challenges, but there is a lot of evolution, and that makes me, I'm an eternal positive person, otherwise I wouldn't be here sitting and working on that. So I think thinking from what has changed, what is doing, like COP26, Glasgow, UK did amazing work as the president of COP to bring the forest to the center of the conversation, of the climate agenda. When we think about climate and nature, deforestation is in the middle. Deforestation, as you mentioned, is emitting a lot. If you think Brazil, 50% of the emissions are coming from land use change. It's a lot. But also, it is the main driver of biodiversity loss. So it is addressing deforestation. It is not a low-hanging fruit, but you are actually tackling two big problems that we have today. So yeah, COP26, we had a commitment from over 140 countries to halt deforestation by 2030. We, at the time, we launched an initiative which is called Innovative Finance for the Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco. And today, this brought together 25 stakeholders, which includes banks, companies, asset managers, providers of catalytic finance. We heard a lot here on the previous point about the importance of concessional finance. What I think is really exciting, like collectively, these 25 organizations, they have committed to 5 billion of investment to support the transition of the cattle sector in Brazil, the soya sector, and we have recently added agroforestry and sustainable management of non-timber forest products. And I think it's the point you said, agroforestry is really important to support the transition. The cattle ranchers in the Amazon, that it is how they make money. They need to be taught how to add or to do another activity. So what we try to do with this 25 organizations is to partner them for them to develop financial instruments which are financing production, which is deforestation and conversion free. Since the launch, 17 financial instruments have been developed, and what we're talking about is long-term loans with grace periods. For example, Syngenta Itaú developed this program, which is called Reverte, which is to restore land in Brazil. We have 40 million hectares of land that needs to be restored to increase food production without creating further deforestation. But Syngenta and Itaú created this long-term loan to help producers to restore land and produce, expand soil production on degraded lands, cattle as a mixture as well, you know. So what is quite exciting is 5 billion commitment to support transition, and via the 17 financial instruments, we already disbursed $500 million, you know, since the launch. So like I said, I think there is a lot of evolution on the topic. It is very much at the center of the conversation of a lot of financial institutions, a lot of governments. I think in Brazil now, we can say very proudly that deforestation has dropped a lot. Indonesia as well, it has dropped a lot. But yeah, agriculture is a high risk sector, so catalytic finance is going to be ultra, ultra important for that. So I'm going to stop here and then we can...
No, amazing points, and to see how the evolution has gone, because this makes us optimists that things are moving.
Yes.
Joanne, within E3G, you have done a lot of studies, and we have tackled here energy, we have tackled forestry, the land uses to cattle, and then we have the industry, which is also a challenge, especially when we are mentioning the hard to abate. So we would love to see within the hard to abate and with what E3G has been studying and the reports, what are the most actionable things, because we're really looking forward for more action. So what are the most actionable and scalable things that you have been seeing? Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I lead E3G's work on clean economy, which includes a specific focus on industrial sectors, steel, cement, chemicals, which have for a long time been referred to as hard to abate sectors. I think the first point I wanted to make today is that we are increasingly trying to move away from using that term for a very specific reason, which is that just anecdotally, when I started working on this sector sort of 5-6 years ago, I think the community thinking about industry decarbonisation was still very much thinking we've got to wait for breakthrough technologies to come down the line in the late 2030s. Today, there is a much stronger sense that we actually already have many of the technologies that we need to fully decarbonise these sectors. And so the challenge, in contrast to where we are with the energy transition, is really that these are sectors in which the clean solutions are not projected to undercut the dirty solutions anytime soon. So the challenge is not so much a technological one, but much more what package of subsidies, regulatory reforms can you bring together to bridge that cost differential. And so really, that's a central message here, is it's not technological, it's a political challenge, and it weaves back to issues that we discussed actually in the first panel around competitiveness, industrial policy. How do you bring these elements forward? The second point I wanted to make, because you asked this question about kind of actionable priorities and where do we see the most promise, is to really emphasize electrification. So again, we also heard this from Ed Weber in the first panel, but we are increasingly seeing that there's a really updated understanding of the feasibility to actually electrify most industrial processes. So a study that gets cited a lot here on European industrial demand from Potsdam University really indicates that 78% of EU industrial energy demand could be electrified today with existing available technologies. So that's absolutely huge. And we're really seeing this also cut through in terms of whole of economy modelling exercises, the EU's 2040 impact assessment, the UK's updated carbon budget. What we're increasingly seeing is that electrification is eating into the share that we expected to be covered by hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. So those are still going to be important levers, but electrification, basically the mission really is to electrify everything as much as possible, and then still use hydrogen and CCS where that is necessary, but we're seeing the kind of differential between those levers come through. The second point I wanted to make on electrification is that it also tends to be a more cost-effective route to decarbonisation. So here I'm referring also to studies that we've seen from industry associations. So this specific one came out from CEFRIC, the European Chemicals Association, last December, where they found that securing access to electricity at competitive prices comes out as the most efficient lever to actually reducing the costs of achieving climate targets. So you have this lever where we've got readily available technologies. This works not just for medium to low temperature heat processes, but also eating into the really challenging ones, steel, cement, chemicals, and it tends to be more cost effective, so we need to be pushing it on all fronts. Which brings me to obstacles. Even if this is kind of what we're terming a low-hanging fruit and where we really need to make progress, we're seeing that even in this area, it is really challenging to move forward. And the particular issue here we're seeing is in terms of building out grid capacity and actually renewables capacity expansion. This comes back to Hilda's points, and Equinor is really where we're seeing some of the fundamental challenges on electrification. So we talked in detail to a German chemicals company last summer that were really interested in electrifying just one process unit of their facility, only 400 megawatts. They went to their utility, they said, we need 400 megawatts. The utility said, okay, great, you can have that in 2035. That is crazy in terms of the amount of electricity we're talking about versus the time scale, and it just shows that there's a huge bottleneck here in terms of actually being able to deliver on what we're calling the low-hanging fruit. So definitely that infrastructure expansion, the kind of political, the package you need to actually deliver on, move on that faster. I'll probably end there, but looking forward to contributions and questions.
Yeah, I will do one round, and I think I'll pass to the, because within all this discussion, what definitely strikes out is that it has to be cost competitive. Because if it's not cost competitive, consumers are not paying green premiums, and even if they were, it will leverage more and more the inflation problem that all over the world we have been facing. So with that said, Hilde, I'll start with you, but I think this is a broader, within the challenges, and what are individually within the companies being thought of in terms of differentiating forms of and business models? And I know that Equinor is really looking to it, because when people criticize, oh, why continue to produce oil and versus offshore wind, we just saw what happened in the US, and like, for who doesn't know, it was a $3 billion investment in offshore wind, and the US regulators just changed their mind in terms of moving it forward. So these are complicated things that when it gets to the end of the day, it makes it difficult to move forward. So within I'm hearing from you, but I think that's different perspectives. How to move the things, and what are companies really facing in terms of getting to these different modelings that would make it competitive, cost effective?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, with regards to the Empire Wind project you referred to, the stop work order has been relieved again, so that is back on track. So that's positive news. But one of the examples of you know, things that can happen and surprises sometimes. But I think the main, in a way, maybe the main hurdle now, or one of the main obstacles, is uncertainty overall. I mean, the geopolitical situation and trade issues, etc. Of course, there is so much investment needed in renewable energy, and with the uncertainty, I think that impacts the ability to raise capital, basically. So that is the challenge overall for everyone. I think for most companies, maybe particularly in the energy sector, also the say-do gap or implementation gap between policies, more on the energy and climate side, versus what is actually implemented into policies. There's still quite a gap, and that makes it difficult to plan. What should you plan for? What the world should look like, or where the market is. So there is a gap there, and companies need to, you can try to move ahead faster than markets, but there are limits to how much faster that you can move than the customers. I think CCS, I mentioned that, it's a very typical example of this sort of chicken and egg issue. The customers are waiting for the models to be perfect and the storage to be in place. Those developing the solutions are waiting for the customers to sign up. So you end up sort of waiting for each other. But I think, yeah, the say-do gap, or the uncertainty and lack of predictability, is something companies don't like in general. So the more predictable and stable, the better for investments. And then I think in renewables, maybe there are things we need to look at in sort of how auctions are run to avoid it becoming a race to the bottom in a way. And we've seen the profitability challenges with many things hitting the offshore wind sector at one time. But there is still a huge investment need in grids.
There are issues on balancing power and intermittency that aren't really yet solved, so that you can have more renewables into the system. And permitting processes, I think that's still an area to work on. Dogger Bank, we talked about that. The licenses, I think, were awarded 12 or 13 years ago, and it's not the building of the project that takes time, it's the permitting processes, and we don't have that time. But we need to do good processes, because there are a lot of nature and community issues, but how can we speed things up, but in a good way? And then I think it's all about, companies need, of course, to see how can we do things better, how can we lower costs, how can we make things more profitable, but in the end, there needs to be incentives. And I want to end on a positive note, because we've talked about EU ETS, and I think we as a company can really sign up to carbon pricing works. It works. It sends signals, and we have been subject to EU ETS for a long time, and that gives you something very clear to work against. So of course there can be challenges. You would ideally have a level playing field everywhere in the world, but that is something that works and create these kind of signals that the companies need.
Does anyone want to go, Robert?
So my comment goes more or less in the same direction, which is this issue on cost competition. And I think one of the fronts we don't speak enough relates to subsidies, especially the negative externalities subsidies in the agribusiness sector. If you take Brazil, for instance, the majority of the financial incentives goes to, in our view, to the wrong direction. So it's virtually impossible to compete with, the mainstream business as usual, let's say, agribusiness production system. We need to remember that the agribusiness sector in Brazil is very heterogeneous, so we are not. We always need to take care on how we include agribusiness as something very homogeneous, which is just the opposite. But anyway, the negative subsidies is one of the major challenges we need to face. Not only subsidies on fossil fuel, but also subsidies in general, and in the agribusiness sector. This is something that needs to be taken into consideration. The other point is the recognition by consumers of everything we are talking. We're still dealing with, connecting everything we talk here on with fear, with negative communication elements. So this is what we are trying to develop is a kind of a new narrative on everything we're talking here. So for our bubble, of course, we all understand the value of nature, but this is not something widely spread. So we're talking to Marcela before just coming here, which is the importance of marketing. And we talk a lot, too much, in my view, on climate finance, but we are not dealing with marketing tools as one of the most important elements in this process. So, of course, when we talk about nature, climate, we're still dealing with a niche market, and this should change completely to a mainstream market. For instance, let's say the vegetarian wave in food consumption, this has nothing to do with climate. It has to do with animal welfare, basically. So the big wave on vegetarianism, which is really important, is something that could be used as a comparison when we deal with this type of products. Finally, my point is the complexity of nature, complexity of climate. We all know how difficult for the financial and marketing guys to deal with this complexity. We are, in my view, still dealing with the surface of that complexity, especially when we talk about nature. We don't have the methodologies to characterize nature capital. We are now trying to better understand this process. We found 88 different methodologies to define biodiversity, maybe another 100 defining bioeconomy, and there is a huge noise in this area. So for the companies to incorporate this type of discussions, this type of value into our, let's say, products and our marketing tools and even the financial instruments is something really very complex. So developing this concept of nature positive starts with the definition and the methodologies to characterize nature. So that is one of the challenges. But not only characterize, we need to come up with very solid instruments to monitor. I think we are advancing in the accountancy, but anyway, this type of word is something that must be included when you deal with all that we're talking here. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if Roberta wants to go. Yes. Daniela or Joanna. Daniela.
Yes, I think one thing that I think political signal is extremely important. We can't deny that. We all discuss about that here today, you know, the importance of regulations and a strong voice. But let's just try to remember, politics change, science is not changing. So I think we need to stick to that, you know. And I think the market has a huge power, and we have seen that recently. You know, market can lead so many things. But again, if we go back, Robert made a very good point about the negative subsidies. Let's call it that way, as opposed to nature positive. Let's talk about the negative subsidies. It's really important, but we also need the financial incentive, you know, to, in our case, we're talking here about forests. And if we look at Brazil, the forest code is extremely strict. 80% of the land in the Amazon got to be conserved. So it's any landowner there can only use 20% of the land. If this guy go to a bank to get a loan, the forest has no value. There is going to be no guarantee. It's not going to be used to guarantee none of his loan. And now what we are seeing, you know, these financial incentives that we are seeing creating now, like I'm sure everyone heard about TFFF, and I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more after as well. But this is really important. You know, we need financial mechanisms that we can actually support the conservation of forests and other important biomes. We are talking here a lot about the Amazon, but in the Cerrado as well, you know, is a biome next to the Amazon in Brazil. And when you look at it, the importance from the Cerrado, from a water perspective, is huge. And one thing that, again, you know, looking at what the private sector is doing and how innovative finance is changing, is looking at, again, going back to the initiative which I was mentioned before. We had 3 supermarkets in the UK, so Sainsbury's, Waitrose, and Tesco, actually committing to having a zero deforestation and what they are doing there is to actually, their suppliers, they are being paid to go beyond the legal requirements. I mentioned 80% of the Amazon is protected. When you look at the Cerrado, it's around 40%. So if we want to have zero deforestation, we need to pay for the landowner to keep the land as well. So, like I said, I think I'm seeing a lot of change, a lot of positive change, but it is complex. And I only believe with this multi-stakeholder collective approach is how we're going to get to our goal, you know, of halting deforestation for the land use change.
Thank you. Quick comment from you, then we'll get one question from the audience. And I'm really, really curious to hear what André Corrêa do Lago has to say about the week and what to expect, implementation, multirão, and all the things we're going to see towards COP. So with you, Joanne.
Thank you, Rafaela. Maybe just one point, because obviously we've heard from very different sectoral perspectives on this panel, and we've had the previous panels as well, but I think a red thread I'm seeing that comes both from the finance panel before and then also from what we've heard from kind of all the speakers here is this emphasis on data, traceability, and regulatory certainty. And I think in a very uncertain trade climate and the kind of challenges we're dealing, there's definitely an impetus for countries to be able to still come together and cooperate on trying to coordinate and create interoperability across data systems, traceability, whether it's in the finance space in terms of what investors want to see from companies to what new mechanisms like the carbon border adjustment mechanism or other aspects of trade like EUDR are expecting. Across all of these sectors, what we're seeing is more and more emphasis on you need to be able to account for carbon in your products, you need to be able to trace where they come from, you need to be able to do this across different sizes of businesses, and that there's clearly demand from the private sector that there's, as you know, even if harmonization isn't possible, that these systems speak to each other. So it feels like if there's one area where, you know, international cooperation should still be able to advance things in this moment where the rest of the system is quite uncertain, that is an element that we should be trying to advance, and where maybe there's something specific that we might see in the COP30 context that could bring some of this forward.
Thank you so much. I think we'll have like one or maximum two questions from the audience. So I see Hosanna here, then one here and one there, and we'll go and we'll have to jump to end up the session. So short questions, short answers. Hosanna, can you? Yeah, you then Hosanna. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Danny, thanks for the really inspiring piece about the 4 million hectares and the financial loans to get the reforestation. What would it take to scale that 10-fold or 20-fold? Question for Roberto and Hilde. Obviously, you both represent very carbon-intense companies and industries, but you've also both your firms have set 2050 net zero targets. What is the one really kind of practical policy intervention or government change that would allow you to be able, and your sectors to be able to decarbonize much more rapidly?
Scale, that's the magic word, but I think we, again, looking at what's being done, we heard Thais here talking about Eco-Invest. And I'm just going to connect the two dots here. I said 40 million hectares of land to be restored. We have a national plan now, which is called the Green Way, which is the restoration of pasture land in Brazil, which is fantastic. It was signed by the President Lula in 2023. And what we are seeing is a very amazing collaboration between the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the National Treasury in Brazil. Is they developed this instrument, which is called Eco-Invest, and they're having an auction now, where the Treasury is actually nearly giving money away for banks. Like if you think about the Brazilian interest rates, not so high, but banks are now going to have access from Treasury money to actually work with land producers, companies, to help with the restoration. They expect this auction, which is taking place now, is going to end at the end of this month, to restore at least 1 million hectares of land. So we are seeing, I think what it takes is, like I said, I think regulations, we need financial incentives, but again, we need to work everyone together. We need to know companies, investors, banks, governments, and producers to sit around the table and break the silo. Everyone lives in a bubble at the moment. So that is what it takes, I think, talking to each other, understanding each other, and developing solutions such as this one, which a few that I mentioned here today.
2 points. First, a national official traceability policy and something like a data lake on everything related to this whole system. So this is something that we need to work. And the second is recognition of tropical forest value. As you mentioned, the forest code brings that into the table, and somehow the agribusiness sector, they are responsible for the largest conservation process and conservation system in the world nowadays, but the recognition of the value is not there. So the tropical forest still is, for the farmers, a liability, considered as a liability. So how can somehow, using public policies, translating from a liability to an asset, and this is something that requires fiscal and financial, I don't like the word incentives, but somehow leveling the playing field at least.
I think my answer will be, sorry, with the same things that help level the playing field. I think if I have to pick one, CO2 pricing, the more countries, the better in a way, works very well. and maybe in combination with some incentives that really unlock large-scale investments, both in whether it's offshore wind and CCS. But for us, really not talking only about ambitions and pledges, but really getting to plans, realistic, pragmatic plans that can be backed up with finance and that are technology neutral, not picking a favorite, but looking at the outcome. Where do you get the most bang for the bucks, in a way, in terms of decarbonization?
Thank you, Hild. I'll pass to Rosanna. Please, Rosanna.
It's very quick. First, I love adding value supply chain, value chain, not supply chain, because actually, in order to have people engaged, you have to have added value closer to where the resources are and not an extractivist model. As Joanna, I think you've talked that all the technologies are on the table, but it's too expensive. You know, in other ways, we have to pay for the green premium. I think as working in the technology, I would like to see your view on that. Perhaps we have to come to the table with other alternatives, not only electricity and hydrogen, but other alternatives, because hydrogen is still too expensive. So what are we going to do from here to there? Then I think that sir that is sitting in the opposite to you can come with some solutions that can help us to go from here to there. So countries like our country can come with other solutions. So I would love to hear your view on that, views based on biocarbons.
We'll take the second question. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Juan E3G. My question is a little bit regarding Johanna's main issue is that we're talking here about different sectors and even geographies. So it's difficult to find like a common thread. But something that we've been working, it's the swinging politics that we haven't spoken with direct impact on business operations. We have already almost like 10 years in the US, Brazil as well. And we've seen also the impacts on the environment. In 10 years, what can be like those already lessons that the private sector can share with us to lock in that investment confidence oriented to climate goals and in the way forward with more swinging politics? Thank you.
Who will start with the answers? So I think Hosanna, first Hosanna.
Sure, thank you, Hosanna. I think the key element that we're seeing at the moment, as you said, sort of the expensiveness of hydrogen electrification in places where we have sort of thought of them as kind of traditional industrial heartlands. I think increasingly the analysis is that what we're going to see is shifts in supply chains to locations where there is high renewables capacity, where we have the raw materials available. And this is something that, you know, the policy context is exploring in detail, this concept of the kind of green industrial sun belt, where Brazil is obviously one of the key countries that comes into play, whether it's from the bioeconomy perspective or the kind of renewables capacity on offer. And here I think the real question, as you said, in terms of bridging that green premium is how can countries be innovative and creative about how you build demand across borders, not just within countries. So we talk about lead markets, public procurement, standard setting to bridge that premium and create that incentive for users of these materials to buy greener. But we should also be doing that across borders and being able to think about how can corporates come together on multi-year offtake agreements? How can governments support that? What kind of public-private coordination do you need to actually see financing scale those solutions? So I think it's less a kind of we need to think about different technological pathways and more we need to think about a different set of politics and ways of coming together to actually create these packages that shift the dynamics in these sectors.
Thank you so much. So being agnostic in different kinds of technologies for different applications. Great. That's the word. So from E3G, the big question, and I love that question, is all over the world we see policy swings, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, and then makes a lot of uncertainty for who's going to put the money on the table, which are the companies. So what from the private sector is required to help lock in like this confidence so that you can really put your money and say, independently where it goes, it continues to make sense for us. Challenging one.
I can try to start. I think it's a great question, and also the comment on of course, the regional differences and etc. But the market would, of course, appreciate more stability, and that seems difficult to get. I think anything that translates into some sort of price signal in any way, or firmer regulations on etc. But real policies and not only ambitions is what companies are looking for. So whether it's carbon pricing or whether it is some kind of incentive scheme, at least something with some duration and that you can actually use in some kind of investment analysis. But it needs to come at that level, I think.
Very briefly, I think there is enough data to say that literally most or all economic activities depend on nature. Now we're talking here about resilience. It's resilience economy, pretty much. So what I believe is that, like my frig here, the NOBIF, they depend on the cattle. They need to invest because business as usual now is no longer going to be an option in 10 years' time. So, and I am a firm believer that sustainability is not the same thing as sustainable finance. You need to invest. The no lack of action now is going to cost in the future. But we need investment, pretty much. But they are two very different things. Sustainability and sustainable finance are completely different. We need investment now. So, and the business case for a lot of the sectors is already proven, and we depend on nature, pretty much everything that we do. So, for me, it's just like, we need to invest. We need the policies, we need the regulations, but economic sector needs to be resilient. Financial sector needs to be resilient as well. So for me, it's a case of like, you are going to be out of business if you don't change.
Yeah, I think the resilience is the name of the game. The disorder is the new order, and uncertainty is how we will, well, that is where we will navigate, and on that word, so in our view, is basically connection with society, being transparent on externalities and strong connections with our consumers.
So with that, we'll end. And thank you very much for all panelists. And I think it was a lovely and fruitful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. We're moving to the last session of our event today. So it's my pleasure to welcome Ambassador André Corrêa do Lago. The ambassador is trustee at CEBRI and, of course, president of COP30. And then we'll have also with us the pleasure of having Nick Mabey, founding director and CEO of E3G. We have a couple of more seats in the front to your right if you want to sit down.
Oh, okay, my name, ooh, a bit too strong. My name's Nick Mabey. I'm the CEO of E3G and also the chair of London Climate Action Week. And of course, we have Ambassador Lago, COP President Designate of COP30 with us for what is going to be a fireside chat, a friendly fireside chat. It's the end of London Climate Action Week. We have been in many rooms together. He has answered many questions from me. So I've tried to think of some new ones. And he's also had to sit in the world's smallest chair table combination ever, so I apologize. I also slightly apologize for Rachel Kite at the gala dinner. making so many height jokes. But you know that's because where she comes from. It's she's a very good compere, it's very true. So, what we want to go through is a set of questions about, which kind of reflective on the ambassador's view of the week and what he's heard and the conversations he's had, hopefully as open and transparent as he's been in other meetings. Of course, we are on the record here, I think, as a meeting. It's a public meeting, so obviously things. But, I mean, the first one thing I want to say, as well as thanking you for spending so much time at London Climate Action Week, it has to be super appreciated by people. I hope it's been useful in helping people help you. The first one is just to get your perspective on the context in which you're trying to deliver COP30. It's easy to say multipolar world, geopolitical turbulence, they're words. But particularly the view from where you are coming into a BRICS summit, you know, quite soon. Obviously the big emitters like China coming along. Just interested, what are the contexts? How do you see that the world, and essentially what COP30 is also going to contribute to making that world more manageable than just turbulent?
So fortunately, the London Climate Week is ending because his questions are getting tougher and tougher. So, look, that's there was a very curious sequence of Brazil's chairmanship. So there was even before the G20, we had the Belém meeting of Amazonic countries. No, then we had the G20, now BRICS, and then COP30. So it's very interesting how. I think the world is seeing the difference between multilateralism and plurilateralism. And many people thought that plurilateralism will solve the problem of multilateralism. And definitely it's not. No? But plurilateralism has is developing stronger and stronger logic. So for instance, when we started the G20, for a climate negotiator, it was quite curious. It's the first time we chaired the G20. Brazil never chaired before, so I had to learn a lot. I was secretary for climate of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Is the fact that the G20 is 80% of the world's emissions. So on one side you said, oh my God, the G20 can solve the climate crisis, no? At the same time, if you talk to the other countries, they say we cannot be led by 20 countries. So it's very curious, the possibilities and limitations. And we tried to use the possibilities by having this original, but that did not continue, exercise to try to bring together the ministries of finance and the central bankers with the climate change negotiators, foreign affairs, and which are the two tracks of the G20 node. So they have meetings separately, and they normally don't mix. And sometimes they deal with the same subject, but they do it separately. And putting them together, I think showed something that is quite useful to understand also the limits of COP30, is that there is no communication inside the governments and inside the states, and you know that very well. And it's very difficult to solve that. So it's a bit like the logic, you know. Some developed countries would tell China 15 years ago, you have to become sustainable, you have to become sustainable, you have to become sustainable. Then China is overwhelmingly sustainable in some areas, becomes unbeatable in solar panels with EVs, and then, now tariffs, because now you're dangerous. No. So, because it's different people that apply the two kinds of, I'm not going to use the word pressure because obviously there is no intention of pressuring, but the intentions for the other's happiness as well. Anyway, so in the BRICS, it's something also a bit like that, but the group is extremely diverse, but it's a different diversity than the G20. And in the BRICS also, we try to have an as ambitious as possible declaration regarding climate. I think we learned many lessons on how difficult it is to deal with a subject that I think all of us in this room, we believe it's an overwhelming and overarching theme that is climate, to people that have still not started to incorporate climate in the way they think how to govern. And this happens in all countries. I mean, it's not developing countries and not developing countries. And it happens mostly because climate change negotiations have become an economic negotiation, and it's essentially about development and jobs, competitivity, etc. So I think many lessons learned, and I think some positive things.
And it's interesting from a diplomatic foreign policy point of view. We have a phrase I continually say in E3G, which is no country is a unitary actor. Often people talk about countries as if they're people. Most people aren't unitary actors either. But that misses the contradictions in different parts of administrations. But also, it seems odd to me that we're looking at a multipolar world with people using analogies from the fight between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece. It's like, that is not an analogy that is useful for me. And we're innovating a new way of running this very crowded world near environmental limits with power very differently distributed. And I think that's one of the parts of climate diplomacy is it goes deep into national politics and administrations, and it is innovative. And you're in charge of the latest step of innovation. There will be a gap in terms of pledges relative to the science. We know that. That's not a mystery. How big the gap is and how ambitious some of the big emitters are is still to be put on the table. But obviously, one of the things that COP has to do is to send a signal to leaders and to investors, but particularly to publics, that this process is keeping them safe. We have to do enough to be credible. And that's obviously going to be more than just NDCs. Can you go through some of the kind of bundle of things the presidency is thinking about in terms of action and commitments, which kind of will create that overall impression at the end of Belém that publics think, yes, it's not solved, but we've moved forward, and we're moving forward at least in a sense of magnitude that's proportionate to it's not a failure. It's not. So I think just saying we've done it again and just the US is out, but everybody's in, it's not enough. So but I know you're thinking through the different elements of the package which need to go into Belém, or come out of Belém, sorry.
Building a little on what you said before, there is no country that is fully committed to climate. So there is that illusion that this is a progressive country, no, they're all divided. And the case of the United States is very interesting because the central government is not, let's say, enthusiastic about the subject, but more than 35 states are very clearly saying that they're going to continue to fulfill the Paris Agreement. Then there's an evaluation that 70% of the American economy is going to continue to follow the Paris Agreement. So it's interesting that when we talk about countries, it doesn't mean countries, no. So we have to operate, and I'm going to use something we were talking in the room next door. We have to operate in layers, no? And I'm going to use something that I use in architecture. For those who don't know, I love architecture, and I write a little about architecture. But when a building has many layers, I mean, and I learned that with our Brazilian architect, Oscar Niemeyer. I mean, the first layer is the the first impression that that building gives, when you're in the street, so it's for a general public. Then when you enter the building and you use the building, there is a layer that is for the users of the building. Then there is a layer that pleases the other architects, and then there is another layer or whatever. So we can operate in many layers. And I think that we tried to show that we have 4 layers for COP30. Now, first, the mobilization, then there's going to be the head of states, then there's going to be the negotiation itself, and then the action agenda. And so that's where I think that we can fit those different elements towards progress, because you can also use the layer to paralyze everything. Yeah. So that's not the intention, definitely. We, on the opposite, we want to show progress because we believe in science, and we know we have, we are in the climate urgency. So we are going to try to use these layers, and how do we put a subject or the development of a theme, and you were mentioning the NDCs, that's why I'm saying that. Many countries think it's illegitimate to discuss the gap in the negotiation because it was not included in the agenda. I know that it sounds a bit strange, but that's how life is, and the agenda needs to have the consensus of 198 countries. So it is an issue, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have a debate about climate change and you're going to have an information about the gap 2 weeks before, and you're not going to talk about it. It's a bit difficult. So where are we going to fit the pieces? Now, in diplomacy, normally you fit these things with some objective. If you're negotiating a peace treaty, you try to give us, I don't know, it's a completely different mindset. Let's say that we will use that thinking of ambition, progress, and stronger commitment to the fact that we have very little time.
Great. And the other, I mean, one of the big innovations, and you've put it front and center, is that this could be an implementation COP, and that's not just about people bringing action agenda things to COP, it's about the architecture of COPs, the role of COPs going forward, and how, or perhaps we say the climate regime. What is the form of this regime, as you say, going forward? Now we're in a different stage. And obviously, you know, COPs have done implementation, so Paris was very interesting, and it's kicked off multilateral development bank reform. The TCFD process of financial reform was powerful, but it was completely outside the negotiating space. And then it was kind of a side event. And then Glasgow made it much more central. We brought Powering Past Coal Alliance, the breakthrough agenda. They became part of the package. But again, didn't really change the formal architecture or role of COPs. Both of these were kind of summitry, a bit of partnerships. But the aspiration seems to be to have something a bit more structured and more embedded in the COP architecture. So I'm just interested in some of the thoughts you've had or thoughts you've heard of how that might be done, but also how, and I know you're still collecting ideas on this, what are places you would welcome people to kind of put ideas to the presidency about how to do this? Because this is, no one's got, we were saying that, no one's got an answer for this. It's about designing a new building, which you have to get people to agree to. And it's certainly somewhere where you're looking for input. So how interested to give people guidance essentially on what you would find useful.
I'm glad you continued with the architecture reference. I think that it is, first of all, our number one objective is strengthening multilateralism. I think this is very clear. And it's not just by principle, but because we are really convinced that climate change, probably most than any other subject, you need to work together, because if someone is not doing it, it's complicated with the others, etc. So we are quite convinced that we have to do that together. So I think that the structure of the negotiation and the logic of the negotiation is what we have. And I think it would be incredibly complicated to try to move that. So let's try to do the best within the rules that we have to negotiate. But the implementation is very different because somehow I believe, and many people believe, that the UNFCCC and the Paris Accord were much more designed for negotiation than for implementation. So I think that this is an area in which we can make lots of progress, and we're listening to many people with suggestions on how to implement better and quicker. So I think that there is a possibility that we may reach, as we get closer to the COP, some interesting dynamic solutions for implementation, because there are many ideas floating around.
Perhaps you can tell us your favourite ideas in the next question. I know you have to be careful. Ideas to the presidency, that's with an open, that translating from diplomacy, that's an invitation to send him ideas. Sometimes you have to translate.
Until the end of August.
Yeah.
Starting September, no new ideas, please.
Yeah, so you're still in the outward glow, and then it's going to be very sharply in. But one of the ideas you have put on the table, the mutirao, which has really been picked up, I mean, this is, Talanoa dialogues, there's lots of these. This one's taken off a bit more, I think, than other, outside the COP world. And London Climate Action Week is a good example of the mutirao concept, and the other climate weeks globally. I'm just interested in your reflection of, as I know, putting out an idea and then seeing it live are two separate things. Just your reflection on what you've seen this week in terms of how people are coming together who don't do climate as their everyday job. This is a lot of people this week this is when they do climate, or they're mainstreaming. Yeah, reflection on what you've seen here and what you've seen as positive, what you think we could do better, but also how us and the other climate weeks, including for the first time Rio de Janeiro Climate Action Week, which will be in August, can help you deliver, but also can be part of this kind of implementation process, because that's the, climate doesn't fit into COP anymore, which is a good thing.
Yeah, well, first of all, I had high expectations, but I think it was even better than the high expectation. And some of the things, I could say many things about the Climate Week, but one of the things, first of all, that we were very happy is that it grew in size at the moment that people were saying that there was less interest for it. So I think that this is already a very good sign. Second is the diversity of people that participate, that I was also quite surprised. And specifically on themes that are going to be related to the COP. First, I was very glad that the word mutirão now is a normal word being spoken in London as a new contribution to the language, but also how many positive reactions to the TFFF, to the Tropical Forest Forever facility. I have to say that I was also very impressed, even more because this is the center of finance. So a series of indications that there is an openness to this theme, but also how conscious people are that maybe we have to make some adjustments, not only in the narrative, but in some approaches. No? We had a discussion the other day if we have to continue to use the word climate, for instance, because there are people saying, no, climate, some people don't like, let's talk about whatever. But I think it is about climate. I mean, you have to accept that. And this debate was quite important here too. But the thing is that there is something that is illogical regarding COPs. The Germans don't like my theory. I don't know if there are any Germans here, but is that it's very strange that there is a UN negotiation about something that is affecting the entire economy, that is touching every sector of people's lives, and we only negotiate it 1 month a year. 15 days in Bonn, 15 days at the COP. So there are, yeah, I'm not going to say it. So the fact is that because of that limitation, we need lots of intermediary moments. And that's why the Climate Action Week fits very much into that. There is a necessity to talk about it more than simply during the periods of negotiations and open many doors. So I think this is really something that fits perfectly into our idea of the mobilization, the period of mobilization, and to bring new ideas. And I was also a bit surprised that it was at the same time as the Bonn negotiation. But in fact, it worked very well to be at the same time. And I think that both end quite on a positive note. Yesterday, Bonn succeeded to finish or advance in some of the negotiations we wanted to see. Important advance to prepare to Belém. It's like the two worlds, the real world here and the strange world of negotiators there. And I think it's very good that we insist that these two worlds have to communicate, but we have to use the liberty of the non-negotiating world.
Thank you for that. The word of this conversation was layers. We go through a few layers. There's probably a few layers underneath the surface, which will only come out in September. So now you know September, the big reveal of the strategy and the destination. So be excited over the summer. So now's your chance to input. Then there will be some choices made. And then the negotiation and discussion towards destinations will come. Thank you so much for that. The other weird thing about COP presidents is you think that André is a COP president. He's not until he gets to Belém. That's why the COP president designate. And then they have to live with the outcome of their COP for the rest of the year when they're actually COP president. So it's like some really strange, like you're not in charge for the preparation, then the thing happens, and then you're there. So we will see the COP president next year, I hope, here. In other words, implementing the amazing agreement he will steer us to in Belém. But I'll just to say, wonderful thanks to have you here. It's been a really enjoyable working with you and your team, the rest of the Brazilian delegation. And any help you need going forward, feel free to ask. And please can we give André a huge round of applause.
And a word for CEBRI for organizing this. CEBRI, as you know, has many qualities, but one of its main qualities, it's in Rio. So, and thank you so much for organizing this, and I'm delighted to be with you. Bye.
Spiritual